Hi, and welcome to the Marshall Assessment Introduction to Science Manufacturing Technician Endpoint Assessment. And this is for standard 0250. There is a newer version of the Science Manufacturing Technician available as of 2024. However, this is the original standard. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today in terms of the different hurdles, the different things that you can expect to find during your endpoint assessment, and how you can best prepare for it as well. Okay, so let's start off with the apprenticeship standard itself and where you can find it. So hopefully you will have seen this information already, but all of the apprenticeship standards that are delivered in England are stored on the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education website. So you can navigate through to that, find the Science Manufacturing Technician ST0250, and you'll find lots and lots of information about the job role. So it does describe the occupational profile. It describes the different knowledge, skills and behaviours that you would need to develop whilst on programme to become competent in your role for your employer. And it also, really importantly, describes the endpoint assessment process. So for an endpoint assessment organisation like Marshall Assessment, we need to understand the assessment plan. We need to be able to follow that assessment plan and bring that to life in a standardised way for all of the candidates that come through to us that we need to assess. So let's get a little bit more detail on that apprenticeship standard. So this is a little bit of a snapshot of the standard itself on that web page, and a link to it as well. So as I said, it does have information about the occupation, the profile, the minimum and perhaps typical duration for somebody on this programme, as well as the academic or vocational level. So this one is at level 3. So it also, as I said, does have information about the assessment plan, and you can just about see that midway down that image on the right hand side in that kind of purplish box. You can see Science Manufacturing Assessment Plan. So really good advice if you're an apprentice looking at this standard, or have it being on it or getting close towards the end of it. Do have a look at that. And you'll see lots of information about how you're going to be assessed. So I'm going to break it down for you now, but it's always good to have that and be as prepared as you possibly can. So what does your journey look like? Well, we talk about different milestones for an apprentice. So at the start of your apprenticeship period, you'll probably have been assessed against English and maths so that your training provider can get a better understanding of how to support you to develop higher level English and maths skills. They also want to assess you against some of the knowledge, skills and behaviours for the apprenticeship standard as well, so they know where your starting point is. So that initial assessment takes all those things into account. And then by far and away, the largest part of your apprenticeship journey is the practical period. This is where you're having training both at work and with your training provider, and you're developing your skills and your abilities to become competent at the right level, so at least at level 3. So you're working towards all of those things. So for some of you it might take 18 months, for some of you it might take 2 years, and for some it might take longer than that. I believe that also would be a qualification. Not in every case, but in the vast majority, there would be a qualification that's delivered alongside this as well, which can take up a lot of time as well for people who are on programme, and that can vary slightly in the type of qual that people might take. It's quite dependent on the employer and what their preferences are. But at some point that is longer than 12 months away from the starting period, that's an important factor, because that's what makes an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship is that it's a long engagement in training and development. But you will finally come to what we refer to as the gateway, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But the gateway is quite an important period, because you only reach it when you feel that you personally are at the right level. You've finished a qualification and you have your evidence that supports the level at which you operate against the key knowledge, skills and behaviours for this apprenticeship standard. You need to have a minimum level of qualification for English and maths, which is at level 2. So a C grade or a 4 grade in English and maths. Or if you haven't managed that, then functional skills pass in English and maths will be accepted as well. So No new learning needs to take place once you go through Gateway. There are some Gateway requirements, which I'll talk about. And then we have this period, this window of endpoint assessment, or EPA. And that's where you will prepare to undertake your endpoint assessment, and then you'll have your day, or maybe multiple days of assessment. Okay, so a little bit more of a diagram just to put that into some perspective. We have your initial assessment, we have on-program learning, developing towards the behaviors particularly as well. So you'll have a behavior log and you'll be assessed against behaviors at least 3 times whilst on program, and those will be recorded. You'll evidence all of your off-the-job training and make sure that you've had sufficient of that, and you'll be preparing your competence evaluation log as well. And then any qualification, an example might be a level 3 diploma in applied science, for example. So Gateway, you've got all of those elements completed. Your training provider also agrees, that's an important part, and your employer is also prepared to sign off on the fact that you need no new learning, that you are the finished article in terms of a science manufacturing technician. Okay, so there are 3 elements to your endpoint assessment. That's what we're here to talk about. You will have an independent assessor, somebody who is not from your training provider, somebody who is not from your employer, who will come along and observe you. So this is known as the Synoptic Assessment Test, or the SAT. So that's where they'll observe you in your workplace and you carrying out your job. They will also then hold a professional discussion with you. This is known as a vocational competence discussion, and you'll see that term in the assessment plan, and we refer to it as the VCD. But as I say, it's a professional discussion around what you do day to day and what you understand, what your skills are and how you behave. And then finally, there is probably the closest thing to a control conditions test that you'll find in this endpoint assessment, and it is a scenario based case study where you'll be reading a scenario and answering some questions around that. So it will feel the closest thing, I suppose, to an exam that's built into this endpoint assessment. So there's been a lot of jargon already. So I'm just going to quickly show you a slide just to talk about some of those terms that you might hear, so that you can be clear on what people are saying, as well as me during this presentation. So IA, we refer to as the independent assurer, would be the IA, also known as the independent assessor. So you might hear that an IA are referred to as either or of those things. We have built into this assessment plan the need during the observation, or the SAT, an employer registered assessor. So they will have a short training course to about 45 minutes with Marshall assessment, and they will be there during your observation hurdle, that assessment hurdle, to assist the independent assessor to make sure that if there is anything which is specific to your organization and your role within it, that can be easily explained, so you don't need to do that. So it's to pick up on some of those workplace specific things that an external person wouldn't be privy to, so to make sure that you're properly assessed. So that person needs to be conflict free, so somebody who's not your line manager and somebody who's not your mentor in the workplace. We would need some support just for that part of the endpoint assessment, just for that observation element. So TP, training provider, behavior evaluation log. So during this program, you will have been assessed against the behavior criteria at least 3 times, could be more than that, up to the final point where you decide that you're ready and you get to this, what we call the gateway. And we need to have a look at how you've been assessed, because that assessment does feed into your overall grade at the end of your apprenticeship. So we'll again swing back and have a quick chat about that in a moment. Synoptic assessment test, yep, workplace observation, so we know what that is. Professional discussion, referred to as the VCD, the vocational competence discussion. Competence evaluation log, you might see the letters CEL on some of our paperwork, but that's the portfolio of evidence, the thing that you will have worked on to put all your evidence into for the things that you're doing, the knowledge you're gaining, the skills you're learning, and those behaviours as well. Scenario case study, is again one of the hurdles we talked about, the thing that's close to an exam. And then the final one here is reasonable adjustments, or RA. So anybody can request with evidence a reasonable adjustment to the assessment plan, and that might be additional time. It might mean a reader or a scribe. So there are things that you can put forward. There's documentation. So we obviously would be looking at those and giving time where it's appropriate to people and making those reasonable adjustments. Okay, well, let's push on then. We've talked about Gateway, so a bit more detail. So we need to have the final behaviour review. That needs to be graded and signed off by your line manager. And the grading of those behaviour statements, you can either be not meeting expectation, meeting expectation, or exceeding. So that needs to be completed, but it's only the final version that we need. We don't need all 3 or 4 or 5. We just need the final, most up-to-date version to take through into Gateway. So then we also need, at this same point in time, your full competence evaluation log. So that's all of the evidence that we'll be discussing with you during your professional discussion or your VCD. So it is there to help you. You can actually bring that aversion in with you, or bring elements of it with you into that professional discussion and use it to support your examples. You don't need to only use those examples. You can discuss other examples as well, but it's always good if you take documents from your competence log that you've prepared, that you can then talk about and discuss with the external assessor. That always comes across as a good thing to do, and it really does help you. It's not necessarily a memory test. It is a knowledge test, but it's not a memory test, so you can take things in there to support you when you're having those discussions. We'll swing back again and discuss that as well. So then the final couple of elements, really, we need evidence of your functional skills, English and maths, so certificates and things like that. It's a prerequisite of the Gateway that you must have those before moving through to be endpoint assessed. We have something called a SAT plan, so synoptic assessment test plan or observation plan. We effectively want to know before we come to see you and arrange the observation element that what we're going to see, if delivered appropriately, will allow you to pass that element of your endpoint assessment. For example, we don't want to come along as an independent assessor and see you sat at a desk or filing or doing those kinds of things. Whilst that might be quite good in a small kind of short burst, during a much larger observation, if that's all we're seeing, then it won't give you everything you need to enable you to pass. So we like a plan. It's always good to see what somebody's going to be doing, and that also helps the independent assessor to prepare as well. Okay, finally, there's a bit of paperwork here. There are some declarations. We need you to sign that you're ready and that you are good to go through to be assessed. We need the employer, your line manager, to do the same. We need to have that information from the employer registered assessor, so that person who's going to support your observation, including a conflict basically a declaration of conflict of interest, so the sign that they don't have a conflict of interest, and then obviously also a declaration from your training provider to say that you're ready. Okay, so here's a bit more information about the maths and the English qualifications. We do need to make sure that you've had training to be working safely. That could be internal or external. Usually that's contained within the log, so that will be part of that. And because there is a qualification that's built into this apprenticeship standard, we would need to see at least the evidence that your qualification has been claimed, if not the actual certificate. And that's again a Gateway requirement for this this apprenticeship standard. So there's a lot there. You won't be involved in on all of it, and in fact the heavy lifting usually gets done by the training provider. So as an apprentice, as long as you know that you've done those things, then that's great, and then we can deal with the training provider and get everything pushed through and signed off. Okay, so shall we have a look at the different assessment hurdles? Let's start with the observation, the synoptic assessment test, and I'll just walk you through what you can expect for that particular assessment hurdle. Okay, so the purpose is really to observe you, the apprentice, carrying out your normal daily duties. But there are some themes that we look at, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. So we want to make sure that you're working in a safe way, but you are competent to do that in your working environment. We have produced a guidance form for more detail, and obviously there is the SAT planning form as well. You will be assessed on the day by somebody coming to see you, walking along with you and observing you whilst you're carrying out your work, along with the employer registered assessor. So in terms of that, the ERA, the employer registered assessor, will have an orientation. They will be told what they need to do, but they will be heavily guided by the independent assessor from Marshall. So they'll have all of that support. And finally, the outcome of your observation is that you either pass or that you fail, that you can carry out those activities competently and safely, or you cannot. So it's not a different level of passing. It's either you do or you don't for this particular hurdle. Okay. So there are some things that in the assessment plan, it does state that the independent assessor does need to see, and there are 3 versions of this. So there is option 1, option 2, and option 3. So the first option, SAT 1, would be where the independent assessor observes part of your observation will be starting up a process, whether that's a batch process or a continuous process, but starting it up. Okay, so that's the first one. If you don't do that on this particular day, you're more operating, making sure that it's going ahead and continuing correctly with the right environment and everything that that process might need in order to carry on and continue, then that's fine. That would be SAT 2. That's you operating the process. Finally, and this probably makes logical sense, the other alternative, the third option, is that you are shutting down that process. So you can choose any of those. If actually we observe more than that, there is no problem with that. So it doesn't have to be only one, but at least one of those, it needs to be done. And it's better if you flag which one it is, so we can make a bit of a focus around that when we're observing you as well. So have a think about what you want to do on your day. It may be that you have never shut down a process, so clearly that would rule that one out, but you would still need to know how it's done later on in your assessment. Okay, right. So the process itself, you will be asked to identify yourself to make sure you are who you say you are, and you're not being misrepresented by anybody else. We also need to make sure that everybody's ready, because it is a timed process. Now you have a minimum of 2 hours during the observation. It needs to at least be for 2 hours, all the way up to a maximum time of 4 hours. So those are, again, built into the assessment plan that was written by employers many years ago now, but that's stated within that assessment plan, and we have to follow it. So you know that you're going to be observed. There may be some questions that are asked, and that could be from the independent assessor, from Marshall, or it could be by the ERA. They are allowed to ask questions, although we do try and limit those as much as possible, because we don't want to put you off your job. You've obviously got some technical things that you need to get on with, so we really need to, to focus on that. But there might be the odd question just to clarify what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it, and that would add then to the richness of the evidence that these individuals are collecting for you. So they will take notes. They may have a clipboard. I do apologise for that, but they need something to write on. So they will have Marshall headed paperwork. It's the same for everybody. The ERA will know exactly how to use that and will be guided again, as I said, by the independent assessor. Once it's all been completed, we'll note the time. So we'll take a log of that to make sure that it meets the requirements for time. And then everybody will sign those documents, but only after all of the notes have just quickly been checked by you. So you may find that your independent assessor will just say, this is the evidence that I've collected, just to make sure that you're happy that it was a fair and accurate representation. And the ERA and the IA will sit down and discuss. And again, it's about making sure that nothing has slipped through the cracks, that if somebody's seen you do something and somebody's missed it, that they can catch up with that and make sure that both copies of the paperwork is very similar. It looks like all of the evidence has been caught and captured there, so they can make a decision on whether you've passed or failed. Now, although the ERA can make a decision, if they don't agree, if the IA and the employer registered assessor don't agree, then the final vote, if you like, would be done by Marshall Assessments. That information would get passed back to our quality team, who will review all of that information and make a final decision. Okay, so we said it's pass or fail. Also said there were some themes. So working safely is what the first theme, and you can see the others there. So we've got following procedures, so standard operating procedure, SOPs, those kinds of things. Complying with regulations internally and externally. Following quality systems, and being able to use the appropriate vocational skills. If you're not sure what that last one is, it would be about manipulating instruments, machinery, competently carrying out your job effectively. That's what it is that we're looking for. Okay, so there are 23 different competencies being assessed, and they fall under those themes. You will be able to see exactly what those competencies are, and it's in the SAT guidance document. So we will make sure that you get a copy of those. If you haven't got one already, do ask your training provider to supply you with one of those. And you can go through it so you can see the types of things that you need to be doing in order to demonstrate that range of different competencies during that day. Okay, so there are some of those competencies that we must see, and there are other competencies that are built into the endpoint assessment that we might see and we might not. So they're not mandatory. But we've found over many times of doing this that there's quite often points within the observation where a candidate will do something that doesn't necessarily fit into those 5 themes, but is really good evidence for us to take through to another hurdle, which is the next one, the vocational competence discussion. So if you've clearly demonstrated one of your skills in your observation, we may not need to approach you and discuss it in the second hurdle. So that's why some of those are mandatory and some are not mandatory. Okay, right. So some of those criteria might be part met as well, just to let you know. So we might go back to it if we've not quite seen enough, or we think we've seen something we want to check and challenge and just clarify something that we might have seen. So it might be quite a quick pit stop into that criteria where we dip in and then quickly dip back out again. Okay, so the SAT plan, the things that you'll see in the SAT plan, effectively it looks a bit like this. These are the types of criteria. Process operations is a theme here. Clean and prepare items of plant, facility and equipment. So we'd want to know what it is that you're doing. You can put a quick description of that into there. When we are putting our information in, when we're assessing, we're doing very similar. That we've seen you do this, this or this, and that's why it meets the criteria. So you can see there's some general themes about safety within this particular section that we're showing you on the screen there. So as an apprentice, you'll need to be able to evidence that whilst carrying out the tasks for your observation. So we've mentioned timescales already. It needs to be within your normal working environment. And a big thing to make sure that doesn't happen is that you don't get coached or mentored during that observation. If there's something that you don't know how to do and it's outside of the standard operating procedures, it's something extraordinary, that might be okay, because that would be your normal working practice, would be to ask a supervisor if something strange happens or something anomalous happens. However, if you're carrying out a process that you're deemed to be competent at and then having to ask for help because you don't know what to do next, that may lead to you not being competent, and it may lead to you failing. The other way of failing this really is around not being safe, putting yourself or other people in some kind of harm's way. That obviously would mean that you have failed your observation. Okay, let's move on to the vocational competence discussion, or the professional discussion, as we often really refer to it as. So as an overview, we will lead the conversation. We will have the criteria that we want to discuss with you. You will be able to bring in with you for discussion any of the material within your competence evaluation log. You can bring in other things as long as you've developed those things during your time on program. It might be an SOP that you want to discuss. It might be a risk assessment that you want to discuss. It might be lots of other things. Remember, I've said it's not a memory test, it's a knowledge test. Do you know how to do this? Do you know why you do these things? And what's the importance or benefits of those kinds of things? So, as I say, you'll be asked questions. They'll be quite open. It will give you an opportunity to discuss it, but it is a timed event. So you will have between an hour and an hour and a half maximum to discuss these things. So do be concise, do answer the question head on. Otherwise, you'll be wasting time later for you to be able to continue the discussions. There is a VCD guidance form. Again, ask your training provider, make sure you've got a copy of it. It will tell you everything you need to know about this hurdle, and it will also share with you how the best way to prepare for it will be and how to best answer those questions. So you can use an electronic portfolio system if you've got one. It could be a little bit tricky depending on how good you are at navigating it. Otherwise, if you've prepared, you might already know there are elements that you're going to struggle with, and that might be something good for you to print out just to grab when that subject comes up, and you know that you can discuss it and you can share that information with your assessor. Okay, so the criteria themselves, the section of the apprenticeship is environment. In this example, listed from the work-based learning guide, the KSBs, we're looking at 32, 34, 35 and 36. So it's understanding the foundations of environmental management. So obviously these organisations quite often produce waste, and how are you dealing with that? How are you dealing with emissions? What is the impact of your organisation on the environment? And that's an impact risk assessment, not a health and safety risk assessment. It's an environmental risk assessment. So don't get confused between the two. Understand the concepts of resource efficiency applied to energy, water and waste. How do you maintain good working practices to reduce effectively your carbon footprint? So you can see the evidence that you need to pass. You need to be able to have examples from your workplace. How do they apply to resource and efficiency? How do they apply to environmental management and reducing your impact on that as an organisation? What do you do? What does the organisation do? And to stretch that out, do you understand and can you evaluate the consequences and risks to the company and the environment for non-compliance? So bigger picture, that's always good if you can discuss how you do what you do, why you do what you do, and then its impact. So what you do, how you do it, impact. That's a really good kind of way to structure a response. So we've put in red on the right hand side here some of the areas or sections that we tend to see people struggle with. So do focus on that. Do prepare. I mean, obviously prepare, but make sure you are preparing for your endpoint assessment. Go through the criteria, prepare what evidence you need, understand how you're going to respond to those questions. And as I say, it's about preparing, and it's not a memory test. So, you know, do prepare, do have those documents to hand. Okay, so that's the second one. The third hurdle and the final hurdle in most cases is the case study. So this is what assessment organizations call a controlled conditions test. So no mobile phone, no additional materials, no computer screen. It's the knowledge that you have against some questions that are set against a particular scenario. Now that scenario, more than likely, I would say heavily likely not to be a scenario that you would be familiar with. It won't be you in your job role for your company carrying something out. But what it will be is a situation within this scientific sector, science manufacturing, and it will be about subjects that you should know. So it's about transferring your knowledge to this scenario. Can you apply what you know given this scenario? Okay, so that's what you've got to think of. It might not be, and probably won't be, a familiar environment to you. Actually, that's the point. It's about knowledge transfer. Could we pick you up as a science manufacturing technician and drop you in a different part of the sector and work for a different organisation with a different focus, but the same job role, the same occupational profile. That's what the government wants to test. Has the investment in you into this sector been effective, or have you just been trained to do your job and nothing else? So that's what they're trying to do. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the more kind of detail around this. You get up to 2.5 hours to answer these questions. It's control conditions, as I've mentioned several times, so no external sources of information, and it will be invigilated. Okay, so it will be like some of your earlier exams, maybe GCSEs or other exams that you've had. Think about that. That's what it will feel like to you. So you're required to answer these questions on that scenario. You need to have a look at the way in which the questions are phrased, and that will give the direction in how you should respond. And we'll talk about those different terms that you need to think about and to identify to get the best answers, the best responses into the questions. Okay, so you need to be able to apply your understanding of the principles of working safely, following quality procedures, and complying with regulations to that new setting. So it's out of 40. So that's how many marks you can expect in total if you add them all up on the paper. Every question has its own set of marks, and that gives you a really good indication of how many points to make, how much depth and detail to go into. Pass mark is 20, so 50%, and a score of 30 or more will actually give you a distinction grade within this assessment hurdle. So do prepare. Do read the questions carefully and do take a note of the amount of marks attributed to each question. Okay. So what's being assessed? As I say, working safely, following quality procedures, complying with regulations. You will be asked questions that have come from the occupational standard. So from the work-based learning guide, we will have created questions and we will have built a scenario that allows you to read the scenario, understand the situation, and then respond to those questions. Okay. So I mentioned reading the questions and making sure that you understand how those questions are phrased so you know what to do. So really with that, I'm talking about command verbs. And so here are some examples of command verbs. So if the question asks you to identify, it might be to pick out a single word. If it says outline, it would be a brief overview, a brief kind of response covering some main points. We get more detailed, we might ask you to analyze. So something specific, analyze in detail to discover the meaning or essential features of a topic or situation, break something down into its component parts. If we ask you to evaluate, we're looking at strengths or weaknesses. If we're assessing, you're comparing something with something else and seeing what benefit that might have against something else. So really do have an eye on how that question is phrased so you know how to go about. So if you get something which is evaluate for 4 marks, then you can see that you need to make 4 points in your evaluation and you need to make a judgment on something or that situation for best practice, or to evaluate consequences or benefits of carrying something out. So make sure that the depth of your response for each question is appropriate to that question. Okay, so some good advice there. And we do have some mock versions of these types of scenarios, so you can get to see how those questions are worded, and you can see the marks attributed, and so you can become familiar with the approach that you need to take. Okay, so moving on almost to the end now. So looking at grading, one of the things that I didn't mention earlier on is the vocational competence discussion. Again, this is marked out of 80, so 50 marks, or for 50%, so 40, sorry, out of 80, 50%, that will give you a pass. Anything over 60, so 75% or more, will get you distinction. So we talked about observation being pass or fail only. The other 2 hurdles are differentiated between fail, pass, and distinction. And then finally, in the green box at the bottom, we're talking about the behaviour logs. So this is something, remember, that you've given to us, or your training provider or your employer will have done at Gateway, and you've got various different behaviours, like 7 or 8 in this particular standard, and you need to have been marked at exceeding expectations in each of them in order to get distinction for your behaviours, okay, overall. So how you're graded: a pass is awarded to individuals that achieve the specified level in all 4 elements. So if you pass your observation, if you get a pass in your vocational competence discussion, if you get distinction in your case study, and you get exceeding expectations in your behaviours, because you didn't achieve distinction overall, you will be capped at a pass. So in order to get distinction, then you need to pass the observation, 60 or more in the vocational competence discussion, 30 or above in your case study, and get exceeds expectations in your behaviours. So if you have a mixture, you will only get a pass overall, even though some elements you will have been awarded distinction in. So far right hand column is what gets you distinction. Middle column gets you a pass. And then unfortunately, if you do fail any of the elements, then you can resit them, and you only need to resit one of those elements, either the synoptic assessment test, the VCD, or the case study. You can resit any of those, but your overall mark will be capped at a pass when you finally complete that assessment successfully. Okay, so one of the key things is that if you go in through Gateway and you already know that your behavior log meets expectation for any of those elements, you actually cannot score distinction overall. Because again, the right hand column, it needs you to get distinction is a pass in the observation, 60 or more, 30 or above, and then exceeding expectation in each of the behavior criteria. Okay, so it's a difficult process for somebody to get distinction. It definitely does happen, but it's a tricky one, a difficult one, a high bar is probably the best way to put it for this standard. But best of luck with everything that you do. Do prepare, as I say. If you've got questions, please ask training providers, and they can ask us if there's anything else that you'd need to know. You can visit our website, has more information about the different assessments, the methods, and some of our policies will be on there as well, should you ever need them. But yeah, best of luck. Hopefully you'll pass everything at least, and you'll be really successful. Thank you very much for listening.